The rain on San Isidro was a living, breathing entity, a suffocating blanket of warm water that fell not in drops but in solid, relentless sheets. It was the kind of rain that silenced the world, drowning out the nocturnal chorus of crickets and frogs, leaving only the oppressive drumming on the palm leaf roofs and the anxious low whines of dogs huddled beneath porches. Inside her small nipa hut, a fragile structure of bamboo and woven palm that seemed to shrink under the storm's weight, Lola Aletta felt the dread deep in her old bones, a cold knot in her stomach that had little to do with the damp chill seeping through the walls. She sat on a worn wooden stool, her gnarled fingers absently tracing the grains of a tabletop smoothed by decades of use, listening. It was a habit born from a long life in a place where the night often held more than just darkness. Tonight, the air itself felt wrong. It was thick and heavy, carrying a metallic temps that coated the tongue and a faint, sickly sweet undertone of something decaying. A scent that every elder in the barrio knew intimately, but never dared name aloud. It was the ghost of a smell, the signature of something that walked on the wind, a thing they only whispered about in hushed tones after the children were asleep. Aswang. Lola, a small, trembling voice whispered from the sleeping mat in the corner. It was Maya, her 7-year-old granddaughter, her large, dark eyes wide with a fear that children should never know. She clutched a thin blanket to her chin. "I'm scared. I heard something. In the mango tree outside, it wasn't the wind. It was ... a scratch, like a long nail on the bark." Lola let his heart clenched. She had heard it too, a dry, rasping sound that slithered through the cacophony of the rain, but she had prayed it was just a branch. She forced her old limbs to move, shuffling across the packed earth floor to kneel beside the mat, her joints protesting. She pulled the child close, the familiar scent of coconut oil and young skin, a small comfort against the ominous night. "Hush now, Enoch," she soothed, her voice a dry rustle. "It is just the storm. The wind plays tricks, makes the old trees talk in their sleep." She smoothed Maya's hair, but her own eyes were fixed on the window, a shuttered opening that felt suddenly like a gaping mouth into the abyss. The single kerosene lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twitch with a life of their own. And then another sound tore through the downpour, so alien and out of place that it froze the blood in her veins. Not a scratch, or a flutter, or a hiss of wind. It was a firm, solid, and unmistakable knock. 3 precise raps on the bamboo post that served as the main support near her flimsy door. A visitor at this hour? In this biblical deluge? No one from the barrio would be out. No one sane. Cautiously, her breath caught in her throat, Lola Aletta crept to the wall and peered through a narrow gap between the slats. A man stood there, tall and unnervingly gaunt, his form barely visible in the murky darkness. He was shrouded in a native Kappa's shell cloak, dripping with rain, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, revealing only the sharp line of a jaw. A large woven bayong sack was slung over his shoulder, seemingly heavy, yet he stood perfectly straight, unaffected by the tempest. "I mean no harm, Apo," a voice called out, strangely clear and smooth as river stones, cutting through the roar of the rain without effort. "I am merely a seller, a humble peddler, seeking a moment's shelter from this unforgiving storm. I have goods. Special goods that may be of great interest to a household such as yours." Against every screaming instinct in her body, a curiosity born of sheer, surreal disbelief made her numb fingers fumble with the simple wooden latch. The door creaked open, and the man entered with a slight, formal bow, moving with an eerie grace. He placed his sack on the floor without a sound. Maya, who had crept up behind her grandmother, buried her face in Lola Aletta's skirt, peeking out with one terrified eye. "What do you sell, stranger?" Lola Aletta asked, her voice tighter than she intended. Her eyes narrowed to slits as she tried to glimpse the face hidden under the hat's brim. The man smiled, a thin, bloodless line that did not reach the shadows where his eyes should be. "Salt Apo," he said, his voice a soft, hypnotic murmur. "I sell the purest, finest salt, harvested from the farthest northern seas, blessed by a forgotten moon. It protects, it preserves, it purifies." His head tilted slightly, and his dark, depthless gaze flickered towards the shuttered window, towards the restless, hungry night. A commodity every household needs, a necessity, especially on a night like this. Lola Aletta's hand flew instinctively to the small, crudely carved crucifix that always rested against her chest, its familiar shape a tiny anchor in a suddenly unmoored reality. Peddlers were a common sight on the sun-drenched paths of San Isidro, but they sold practical things. Clay pots, brightly colored textiles, sharpening stones, and sweet treats for children. They did not travel through the heart of a howling typhoon to hawk something as mundane and universally owned as salt. It was an absurdity that chilled her far more than the damp wind now coiling through her small home. "We have salt," she stated, her voice firm. A forced bravado meant to shield the child clinging to her and to establish a boundary with this unsettling presence. The man's smile, that thin, bloodless line, did not waver. "Do you?" he asked, his tone implying a world of hidden meaning behind the simple question. He leaned forward, the movement fluid and silent, and untied the neck of his woven sack. Instead of plunging his hand in roughly, he slipped it inside with a strange reverence. When his fingers emerged, they were cupped around a mound of crystals so brilliantly white they seemed to generate their own light, casting a faint ethereal glow onto his pale palm. These were not the coarse grayish grains she bought from the market in town. These were geometric, perfect prisms, like a million tiny frozen stars, each one catching the lamplight and fracturing it. "Is it salt like this?" he pressed, his dark eyes finally lifting to meet hers, and in their depths she saw no reflection of the lamp's flame, only a void. Salt that whispers to the shadows and tells them to keep their distance. Salt that knows the old names for protection. He tilted his hand, and the crystals trickled through his long fingers in a silent, shimmering cascade back into the depths of the bag, making no sound as they fell, as if they were not truly solid. Maya, her childhood curiosity, momentarily overpowering her fear, loosened her grip on Lola Aletta's skirt and leaned slightly forward, mesmerized by the beautiful, glowing substance. "It's pretty, Lola," she whispered, a small gasp of awe in her voice. "A wise child," the peddler crooned, his attention shifting to Maya with an intensity that made Lola Aletta want to step between them. "She sees its true nature. For you, because you have been so kind as to offer shelter to a weary traveler, a special price? Just 1 peso for a small pouch. A bargain, would you not say, for such potent peace of mind?" The price was ludicrously cheap, another piece of absurdity that twisted the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She wanted nothing more than for him to be gone, to take his unnatural silence and his glowing salt and vanish back into the storm from which he came. Her movements were hurried, fumbling as she found a worn single peso coin in a small tin on a shelf and almost thrust it into his waiting hand. His skin was cold and dry like polished stone, and the touch sent a jolt up her arm. He took the coin, and with the same deliberate care, he poured a measure of the luminous salt into a small cloth pouch he produced from within his cloak, tying it shut with a deft twist. He placed it neatly on the floor between them, a tiny, glowing promisor, a threat. "Keep it close," he instructed, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow clearer than a shout. "Sprinkle it on your windowsills. Line your doorways. Be generous. Do not be frugal with it, for the night has many hungers, and they are patient." And with that, he rose smoothly, turned, and slipped back out into the roaring black rain. Swallowed by the darkness so completely, it was as if he had never been there at all, leaving behind only the chilling echo of his words and the faint, ghostly light emanating from the pouch on the floor. The morning after the storm dawned bright and violently clean, the world scrubbed raw and steaming under a relentless sun. The horrors of the night before, the gaunt peddler and his unnatural salt, felt like a fever dream, a phantom story conjured by a frightened mind in the heart of a typhoon. The air, once thick with a metallic dread, now smelled only of wet earth and blooming jasmine. Lola Aletta moved through her morning chores with a stiffness that was only partly from her age, the memory of the previous night a persistent, cold pebble in the shoe of her mind. She saw the small pouch where she had left it on the shelf, its plain cloth seeming innocuous in the bold daylight. Maya chirped, her fear forgotten, already reaching a small hand up towards the intriguing pouch, eager to play with the pretty crystals. "It is foolishness," Lola Aletta muttered, more to herself than to the child. A reflexive dismissal of the old ways she had been taught to suppress in the modern world. Yet a superstitious tremor in her soul prevented her from simply throwing it away. Instead, she pushed it further back on the high shelf, behind a clay jar of rice. A decision to be revisited later, a problem to be ignored into oblivion. But oblivion would not come for San Isidro. The news arrived with the afternoon heat carried on the hushed, urgent voices of neighbors gathering by the communal well. Aline Rosa, whose hut was the farthest out, nestled against the jungle's ever-encroaching green wall, had found one of her prized pregnant sows in a state of abomination. The piglet it had birthed in the night was not just stillborn. It was a twisted, hairless thing, its pale, slick skin stretched over a form that defied nature, featuring two malformed heads that lolled on a single tooth-thin neck and a cluster of tiny, useless legs. It was an old, bad omen, a sign everyone over 60 recognized and feared, and the grim faces of the village elders, as they gathered to look and then quickly bury the thing, spoke volumes that no one dared translate aloud. Later, as the sun began to dip, turning the sky the color of a bruise, young Ben, returning from checking his fields, found one of his laying hens lying limp in the dirt of his yard. It was not mauled. It was pristine, except for its neck, which was twisted at an odd angle and featured two small, precise puncture wounds. And the fact that it was utterly drained of blood, its body light as a husk. The fear, once a whisper, began to curdle into a thick, palpable terror that seeped into the very bamboo walls of the homes. That evening, Lola Aletta found herself standing before Caselso, her proud, stubborn neighbor who was mending his fishing net and scoffing at the superstitions of old women. She told him of the peddler, of the salt, her voice low and serious. Caselso snorted, not even looking up from his work. Salt? And you paid the charlatan? You saw a storm and a frightened old woman, and played you for a fool, Aletta. My house is strong. My bolo is sharp. That is all the protection I need from stories meant to scare children. Defeated and more afraid than ever, Lola Aletta returned to her silent home. The scratching in the mango tree had not yet begun, but the evening felt watchful. With a sigh that came from the marrow of her bones, she dragged a chair to the shelf, retrieved the pouch, and with hands that trembled only slightly, poured a thin, meticulous, glowing white line across her windowsill and another unbroken one in front of her doorway. That night, the scratching returned, restless and persistent, but it did not try to cross the threshold. 2 nights later, the air in San Isidro had not cleared. It had thickened, becoming a broth of unspoken fears where every rustle of a banana leaf and every hoot of a distant owl was scrutinized for malevolent intent. The memory of the 2-headed piglet and the bloodless chicken hung over the barrio like a pall, a confirmation that the old stories were not just stories. It was on this second night of watchful, brittle silence that the peddler returned. His approach was again silent, but his presence seemed to precede him, a wave of cold that pushed against the warm, humid air. This time, his knock, those 3 precise, solid raps, landed not on Lola Aletta's door, but on the much sturdier bamboo frame of Caselso's house. Caselso, who had spent the evening loudly proclaiming his skepticism to his nervous wife, jerked the door open, his face a mask of annoyance etched in the dim light of their single lamp. He grunted, his voice dripping with disdain as he took in the gaunt figure, the wide-brimmed hat, the silent, imposing presence, the salt cellar, the charlatan. Move along.
We don't want your tricks here.
We are not frightened children to be fooled by glowing rocks. The peddler's face remained a placid, unreadable mask, utterly unaffected by the man's hostility. I hear misfortune has visited your barrio, the peddler stated, his voice that same smooth, carrying murmur. A 2-headed pig, a bloodless chicken.
Ow.
The signs are clear to those who know how to read them. My salt is not a trick. It is a shield, forged for precisely such times as these. The price remains a single peso, pittance for a barrier between your family and the hunger that walks abroad. Caselso's laugh was a short, harsh bark that held no humor. A shield? Yeah, my own shields. Get off my land. He boomed, his voice too loud for the quiet night, brandishing his calloused, empty hand as if it held a weapon. I don't trade with devils or their messengers. Take your witchcraft elsewhere." The peddler didn't flinch, didn't show a flicker of anger or frustration, simply bowed his head in a gesture that could have been respect, but felt more like a dismissal. "As you wish," he said, his tone unchanging. But the hunger does not discriminate between the brave and the fearful. It does not care for pride or sharp bolos. It only knows the scent of the unprotected, and it is a patient hunter. He turned, not back towards the path, but directly into the deep, inky shadows that pooled between Caselso's thicket of banana trees. He didn't walk away, seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, his form dissolving into the blackness until there was no sign he had ever been there at all, leaving behind only his chilling words hanging in the heavy air. Caselso slammed his door shut with a force that shook the entire structure, muttering a stream of curses about idiots and charlatans. He told his cowering wife to stop her useless praying and go to sleep, that he had handled it. But as he lay down, the night outside his walls felt different. It was unusually, profoundly quiet. The insects had stopped their chirping. The very world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a signal he could not hear, and for the first time that night. A sliver of cold doubt began to worm its way through his certainty. The scream that tore through the pre-dawn silence of San Isidro was not a sound of pain or surprise. It was a raw, primal vocalization of pure, unadulterated horror. Sound that seemed to shred the very fabric of the quiet morning and freeze the blood of everyone who heard it. It was Caselso's wife, and the terror in her voice was a contagion that spread instantly. Pulling people from their beds and into the gray, misty light, the village, a single, panicked organism, converged on their home. The front door, which Caselso had slammed with such defiant force just hours before, now swung open on its broken hinges, creaking a mournful tune to the gathering crowd. Inside, the scene was one of meticulous nightmare. His wife was found huddled in a far corner of the main room, her body curled into a tight ball, her knuckles white as she clutched a rosary to her chest. Her eyes were wide open, but they saw nothing of the present. They were fixed on some internal horror, glazed and unseeing. When someone touched her shoulder, she didn't flinch. She merely pointed a trembling, accusatory finger towards the doorway of the single bedroom. The crowd pressed forward, a wave of dread pushing them into the small space. Caselso was on his bed, lying on his back atop the rumpled sheets. He was technically alive. A faint, shallow rise and fall of his chest was visible, a ragged, wet sound escaping his lips with each difficult breath. But he was empty. His robust, proud form seemed shrunken, collapsed in on itself, his skin possessing a waxy, pale translucency that was utterly unnatural, like a candle that had burned down to nothing. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling's thatch, devoid of any spark of consciousness, of any essence that had made him Caselso. The old ones in the crowd whispered the terrible term they all feared: Linupod, his soul. His life force had been siphoned out, consumed, leaving only this breathing husk behind. And on the floor, leading from the bed to the open window where the early morning light was beginning to filter in, were a set of wet, muddy footprints. They were all wrong-elongated, with a strange, distorted shape and a sharp, claw-like impression at the front. A print that belonged to no animal or man any of them had ever seen. The only thing that seemed out of place, that did not belong to the horror of the scene, was a single, perfect, gleaming white crystal of salt, resting on the floorboards right in the center of the room. As if it had fallen from a great height or been deliberately placed there, a tiny, mocking monument to the protection that had been offered, and so arrogantly refused. Lola Aletta, holding a crying Maya's hand tightly in her own, felt a cold, sickening certainty grip her heart. The peddler hadn't just been selling salt, he had been selling a choice. And Caselso, in his pride, had chosen wrong, and the price had been everything. Panic, they say, is a more contagious and swift-moving disease than any plague. And by the following noon, it had seized the entire barrio of San Isidro in a feverish, trembling grip. The grim discovery at Caselso's house had evaporated the last vestiges of doubt, placing them with a raw animal fear that was smelled on the air and seen in the wide, white-rimmed eyes of every neighbor. The men, who just days before had spoken of hunting the creature with bolos and torches, now moved in nervous, tight-knit groups, their bravado exposed as a thin veneer cracking over a bottomless pit of terror. They talked in low, urgent voices of searching the woods, of forming hunting parties. But their feet remained rooted to the packed earth of the village clearing. Their courage rendered hollow by the undeniable proof that the enemy was not some beast that could be fought with steel, but a pervasive, patient evil that fed on the soul itself. And as the sun began its inevitable descent, painting the sky in ominous, bloody shades of orange and deep purple, the architect of their dread appeared once more. He did not approach any single door, did not need to seek anyone out. He simply materialized in the central clearing of the barrio, a tall, gaunt silhouette against the dying light. His woven sack placed deliberately at his feet like a merchant at a market. The entire village watched him from behind half-closed shutters and cracked doors. A collective breath held, paralyzed by a horrific mixture of fear and a desperate burgeoning hope. People of San Isidro. His voice rang out, clear and calm and cutting through the thick silence like a knife. You see now that the old stories are true. You have witnessed that the shadows have grown bold and the old protections have grown weak. He paused, letting the weight of his words, of their shared horror, settle upon them. Then he bent and opened the neck of his sack, revealing the familiar mound of glowing, ethereal white salt that seemed to pulse with a soft internal light in the gathering dusk. I offer you a new one, a sure one. He held up a single pale finger. The price remains the same, 1 peso. 1 single peso for a night's safety. 1 peso for the peace to sleep. 1 peso for the continued life of your family. Who among you will pay it? This time there was no refusal, no proud boasts or skeptical laughter. A desperate, silent queue began to form, a solemn procession of the terrified. One by one, families emerged from their homes like ghosts, their faces drawn with fear, hands shaking as they extended their coins. The peddler took each one with a slight, formal nod, his expression unreadable, and handed over a small pouch of the miraculous salt. Each family would then scurry back to their home, frantically lining every windowsill, every crack in the bamboo, every doorway with the glowing white substance. Their movements hurried and frantic as the last light bled from the sky. That night, from her own window, Lola Aletta saw them faint, shifting shapes, moving with an unnatural, skittering grace at the very edge of the jungle line. Pale, indistinct figures with elongated limbs and glimpses of something long and flickering in the moonlight. Circling the protected houses like frustrated sharks, their hungry, hissing whispers just audible on the edge of hearing. A terrifying sound that was somehow worse than any outright attack. The barrio was safe for now, but it was a safety purchased in a currency of pure dread. And the air was thick with the price. The peddler did not return the next day, but the fragile piece he had sold began to crumble almost immediately, eroded by a new, more insidious form of terror. The initial panicked application of the salt had been wasteful. In their desperation, families had poured it thick and heavy, using entire precious pouches in a single night to create glowing white fortresses around their homes. Now, as the sun set on the second day, the reality of its scarcity set in, and the precious substance was dwindling to nothing more than a few faint scattered lines. Arguments broke out in hushed, frantic tones behind closed doors, accusations of carelessness flying between husbands and wives. Some tried to stretch their supply to mix the magical crystals with common coarse market salt. But the moment the two touched, the common salt seemed to leach the power from the other, turning the entire mixture a dull, lifeless gray, its protective glow extinguished forever. This new fear was a slow, cold poison in the veins of the village. What happens when the salt is gone? The Aswangs were still there. Everyone could feel it. A repressive watchfulness from the tree line, a patient, predatory hunger that had been teased and would not simply vanish. They had tasted the fear of San Isidro. They had marked it. That evening, as the shadows stretched long and the familiar dread began to coil in every stomach, the peddler returned. A faint, desperate hope flickered in the eyes of those watching from their windows. But it died a swift death when they saw him, carried no large, promising sack over his shoulder. His hands were empty. "You have come for more pesos," the man finally called out, his voice cracking with a mixture of hope and despair from his doorway. "We have them. We will pay. Just name your price." The peddler stopped in the center of the clearing, the same spot as before, and slowly shook his head, that thin, terrible smile playing on his lips once more. The introductory price has ended, he stated, his voice flat and final. The promotional period is over. The currency has changed. A dead, chilling silence fell over the barrio, so complete that the rustle of the night insects sounded like a roar. Lola Aletta, watching from her hut, felt her blood turn to ice. What? What do you want? She asked, her voice barely a whisper that somehow carried in the stillness. The peddler's dark, depthless eyes scanned the frightened faces peering from the homes. His gaze a physical weight that lingered on the children hiding behind their parents' legs, their small forms trembling. The hunger must be fed, he said, as if explaining a simple, natural fact of life. It is the balance of things. The salt keeps it at bay. It builds a wall, but it does not sat the appetite. It only redirects it. For a new pouch of salt, you must provide the sustenance it craves. He let the horrifying implication hang in the air, allowing each person to fully comprehend the monstrous bargain. You must leave an offering outside the ring of salt at the edge of your property. A chicken, a pig, something of life, something of blood that will buy you a pouch. For a larger amount of salt, for a longer guarantee of safety. The offering, of course, must be greater. He was not just a seller, he was a broker, a middleman between the village and the monsters in the dark. He was selling them their own survival, night by terrifying night, and the price was no longer a coin, but a piece of their livelihood, their security, and ultimately, their very souls. Some of the villagers, a handful of the most devout or the most stubborn, refused the peddler's new terms outright, calling it a blasphemous pact with the devil himself. A deal that would damn their souls far faster than any physical death an Aswang could deliver. They barricaded themselves inside their homes with whatever common salt they had left, trusting in prayer and the strength of their bamboo walls to see them through the night. Their fate was discovered the next morning, a grim and silent testament to the futility of their defiance. They were found in their beds, just as Caselso had been technically alive, their chests rising and falling in a shallow mechanical rhythm, but utterly hollowed out, their eyes vacant windows to a nothingness within, their spirits and life force completely consumed, leaving behind only breathing, empty shells that would soon wither and die. Their fate broke the will of everyone else. The others, their spirits shattered, and their resistance eroded by a terror greater than damnation, complied. The sounds that began to mark the approach of dusk in San Isidro were no longer just those of the night. They were the sounds of a community dying from the inside out. The air was filled with the heart-wrenching sound of weeping, the low, mournful pleading of farmers as they led their best piglet, their fattest goat, to the very edge of their property, their hands shaking as they tied the terrified, struggling animal to a post driven into the earth, just outside the fragile, glowing white line that marked the boundary of their safety. They would then hurry back inside, behind their salt-lined doors, and wait, listening in the oppressive silence, their own hearts hammering against their ribs. The frantic, terrified squealing or panicked bleating of the offering would always be cut short by a sudden, wet, silencing sound, a brief scuffle, and then a profound, unnatural quiet. In the morning, only a pale, drained carcass would remain, its body cold and light, all vitality siphoned from it. The peddler would arrive at dawn, not with his sack of salt first, but to quietly and efficiently collect his bloody payment for the salt he had provided the night before, moving from house to house like a morbid tax collector. The barrio was alive, its people breathing, but it was a living death, a community feeding its own livelihood, its future and its sanity, to the darkness in a desperate, degrading bargain to survive another day. Lola Aletta, with her meager resources, had nothing left to offer but her one scrawny, old laying hen. She knew its scrawny body, its thin blood, wouldn't be enough to satisfy the broker for long. The peddler's eyes, during his morning rounds, had already started to linger on little Maya, who clung to her grandmother's skirt, a speculative, calculating glint in their dark depths that filled Lola Aletta with a colder dread than any night creature ever could. Lola Aletta knew, with a cold and terrifying clarity that settled deep in her ancient bones, what she had to do. The peddler's lingering gaze on Maya was a promise of a horror she would not allow to pass. It was a bill coming due for a debt she refused to pay. The knowledge was not her own, but a ghost of a memory, a forgotten tactic whispered from her own grandmother in a time when the world was darker and the old ways were not just stories but necessary tools for survival. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, a flicker of defiance against an overwhelming darkness. With trembling hands, she took the last few precious crystals of the magical salt from her nearly empty pouch and placed them into a small stone mortar. She ground them into a fine, luminous powder, the action a quiet prayer in itself. To this, she added a few drops of holy water she had kept from a visit to the distant church years ago, and the flakes of rust she had carefully scraped from the blade of an old, blessed knife that had belonged to her father. She mixed it into a thick, grayish paste that seemed to absorb the lamplight. Then, while Maya slept an uneasy sleep, she drew a small, intricate, an ancient symbol on the child's forehead, a looping, complex pattern meant to confuse and misdirect, to make the wearer seem invisible to a predatory gaze. That night, she did not lead an animal to the edge of her property. She stood just inside her doorway, behind the faint, almost depleted line of salt, and waited, her entire body tensed for a fight. The peddler emerged from the shadows as if born from them, drawn by the lack of an offering. He looked at her empty hands, and for the first time his placid mask slipped, revealing a flicker of cold annoyance. "The agreement is broken," he said, his voice losing its false warmth, becoming a flat, venomous hiss that seemed to slither across the space between them. "We have nothing left to give you," Lola Aletta stated, her voice low and steady, though her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The peddler's eyes began to glow with a faint, hellish red light from the depths of his hat's shadow. He took a step forward but halted abruptly at the salt line, as if it were a wall of searing flame. He smiled then, a terrifying rictus grin. "Everything has a price. The child. Give me the child, and you will have salt for a year. A lifetime of safety. A final transaction." He pointed a long, bony finger directly at Maya's sleeping form. Lola Aletta didn't move a muscle. "You cannot have her." "Then you choose death for you both," the peddler snarled, his form beginning to contort and stretch, his skin darkening to a mottled gray, his mouth distending to reveal a long, needle-like proboscis. He was not just a broker. He was one of them, the ultimate predator. He lunged, not at the door, but scrambled up the thatched roof with inhuman speed, tearing at the palm leaves, seeking a way in from above. But Lola Aletta was ready. As the creature's grotesque head thrust through the hole in the roof, she didn't scream. She threw her last handful of the pure, unmixed, brilliantly white salt directly into its face. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The creature, the peddler, let out an unearthly, guttural shriek of pure agony. The salt sizzled and burned on its skin and eyes like acid, smoking and blistering, eating away at the unnatural flesh. It recoiled violently, blinded and shrieking, losing its grip and tumbling from the roof into the dirt with a heavy, sickening thud. It scrambled to its feet, its human form partially returned, but now a blistered, weeping grotesquerie. It fixed its ruined face on Lola Aletta, a look of pure, undiluted hatred burning in its one good eye. "This is not over," it rasped, its voice a ruined, gurgling thing. "The hunger never ends. We will be back. You will all be ours." It then turned and fled, limping and stumbling into the dark, swallowing jungle, its cries of pain and rage fading into the oppressive silence of the night. The next morning, the barrio was silent. Now the salt lines had faded to nothing. The Aswangs were gone. For now, Lola Aletta held Maya close, her eyes fixed on the tree line. The peddler was gone, but his lesson remained, carved into their souls with a cold chisel. True safety was never for sale. It had to be fought for with courage and with cunning. And she knew with a certainty that was her final, heaviest burden, that the price of their survival had only been deferred, not paid. Somewhere in the deep primeval dark of the forest, the seller was healing, and his buyers, the ancient hungers of the world, were still waiting, eternally patient,